Hello, everybody. I just wanted to kick things off. Welcome, everybody, for joining us right now. We still have a few people that are calling into the webinar, but I wanted to say a few introductions just to get us going on time. And so just wanted to remind everybody that we will be recording this session, and it's something that we'll have available online later on. And also reminding everybody that we do have a lot of information on our website, a lot of materials, resources related to COVID that are there available on our website. And here, some of the information materials that we're going to have about the vaccine are going to be available there as well. We also got questions submitted in advance of this webinar to us, and we're going to try and get through as many of those as possible towards the end here. So just to kick things off, I just wanted to introduce this as one of our COVID webinars. We're going to focus on a very specific topic of the vaccines there. There's obviously things that are still going on with COVID generally. We still have a strong recommendation for people in the community to be staying isolated still right now and following those protocols. But here, we're really going to focus down on the vaccines and vaccination and get into a lot of specifics there. And I think what we'll try and cover is the issues around the vaccines, specifically for the SMA community. This is obviously a broad effort for the whole community. There's the advantages that come to everybody when there's the herd immunity and things like that that protect everybody. But we're going to try and focus on the vaccines for SMA individuals, families, caregivers, the particular kind of issues and prioritizations that we're working on for our community. And those are some of the topics that we'll get into. I guess what I would say, just to kind of frame things up and just as we invite Dr. Mary Schroth to come on, is, you know, we've been looking at trying to make sure that the SMA community stays safe from COVID. And so far, our answer for that has been staying isolated. Here now we have the new opportunity that's coming up to stay safe from COVID, which is vaccination. And so it is the alternative, is what we've been looking for, not just to have to stay isolated, but the vaccine that's going to keep us safe from COVID. And then the big part of this is that then will let us get back to our more normal activities. So that's kind of the very exciting thing with the vaccinations. So Dr. Mary Schroth, invite you on. I don't know if there's anything else you want to say as an introduction and then to kick things off.
Thank you, Kenneth. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We are so pleased at SMA to provide this webinar about the COVID vaccines to the SMA community. And we're so pleased to have two experts to provide this information. Dr. Tim Cripe, who's the Chief of Hematology Oncology at Nationwide Children's Hospital, and Dr. Tim Franson, who is a principal at Faegre Drinker Consulting. So first, next slide. So I want to start by sharing with you our third community COVID-19 survey. So we've actually conducted 3 rounds of asking you, the SMA community, your experience with COVID. And what I want to share with you today is the latest information. So first of all, the areas in green are showing improvement. The area in yellow is staying very stable, and the area in red is going up. There were 814 individuals who responded to our survey, and what we saw is that 33% are having their have their SMA medical appointment canceled or delayed, which is a decrease from previous surveys. So we're seeing a downward trend, which is good. Fewer appointments are being canceled. 47% had changes or limitations accessing essential SMA services, for example, physical therapy, and that's also improving, although still quite high. 26% of respondents lost their job or had their working hours reduced, which also is improving. 45% were financially impacted. 19% had their SMA treatment or therapy canceled or delayed, and that has been very stable throughout through this time with COVID. And what we've seen is that there's been a significant increase in the number of people exposed or who have had COVID, and we've also seen a significant increase in the number of people who've been hospitalized. So we know of approximately 25 to 30 people who have had COVID. And the question I get asked probably the most often is, what happened? And what I can share with you is that symptoms have ranged anywhere from loss of taste and smell to having fever for a few hours to several days, along with the fatigue, up to people who required hospitalization and required intubation for respiratory distress, but did well, were able to go back to BiPAP and return home. So again, the SMA community is an at-risk community. There's no way around that, in my opinion. Next slide. I want to remind people that we still have support packages available. Please go online and access these programs if you have not thus far. We have a COVID-19 personal protective equipment package, and that is the link. And then we also have the COVID-19 assistance program, which provides a $50 gift card to help with purchasing things like meals, groceries, other essentials. And as part of the assistance of these programs, we ask that you also complete this survey, the results of which I just shared with you. Next slide. So we're all in this struggle right now of trying to figure out vaccine access. Vaccine has become available, although in very limited quantities. And as we're hearing at the federal level, the amount of vaccine that is becoming available is increasing every week. And we look forward to that. Again, people with SMA are at risk. They're in the at-risk group. And we recommend access with the 1B, 1C groups. Please know that we have been advocating for SMA to be included in that at-risk group with federal agencies, state agencies, local agencies since the summer before we even had a vaccine. So they're aware, there's an awareness about it. What you won't see though is a specific listing for SMA or neuromuscular diseases when you're going to try to schedule an appointment, and it asks you, why do you think you're an at-risk individual? If there's an opportunity to check other, please do explain it. We have a letter supporting your at-risk status. And this applies not only to people with SMA, but also their caregivers and household folks. Attached to this webinar is a document that advocates for access to the vaccine. We encourage you to download that letter. It's also available on our website, but you can do it today as part of this webinar. So please utilize those resources. Also, I want to make the point that if you have a child with SMA and they're too young to receive the vaccine, which is the status currently, parents and caregivers, those around those children who are too young, should get the vaccine. And that letter also advocates for that as well. Next slide. So what we've learned is that to find the most up-to-date information is to go online, search for state-specific public health. You know, I live in Illinois, so I would look at for the Illinois Public Health and COVID vaccine, and that will take me to the Illinois Public Health Department website. And from that website, it will take me to where's the vaccine being administered, who are they considering in their at-risk group. And again, you're not going to find SMA or neuromuscular disease in that list because, again, there are just so many rare disorders that fit into that category that they just haven't specifically listed it out. But SMA is an at-risk group. Where the vaccine has become available from everything that we are seeing is either through the local public health department, through your healthcare provider or your healthcare system. Employers, some employers are offering the vaccine, not every employer, and also local pharmacies like Walgreens, CVS, Osco, and Kroger. There are a variety of local pharmacies around the country that are offering vaccine. And again, the vaccine is in limited supply. Appointments become available online at various times and are probably open until they're filled. But it will require patience as well as persistence and just refreshing the screens to get access to those appointments. Every week, more vaccines are being shipped out from what we're hearing. So again, we encourage you to get the vaccine and be persistent. Next slide. I also just want to remind people that we have our webpage. There is information here. We have a frequently asked document related to the COVID vaccines as well as the COVID infection. We'll be updating the vaccines FAQ in the next week with all of the questions that you have sent us and are sending us now. So again, I encourage you to go there for information. And for any questions, please send them to us at info@curesma.org. Next slide. So I'm so pleased to turn over this presentation to our two speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. Tim Cripe, who is the Chief of the Division of Hematology and Oncology at Nationwide Children's Hospital. He is also Professor of Pediatrics at The Ohio State University. His research interest is immunotherapies. Dr. Cripe, please teach us about the COVID vaccine development. Thank you.
Yes, happy to be here. Thank you, Mary, for the invitation. If you could have the next slide, please. I just wanted to start by describing the different types of COVID-19 vaccines that are currently either approved for emergency use or in development. And they are basically three different types. The first type is protein-based, second type is viral vector-based, and the third is mRNA-based. And all of three result in the same end game. That is, they produce a protein that's shown there in the sort of orange color that the body produces, the spike protein or the spike protein, and it's analogous or identical to the spike protein that's on the virus, but that's the only thing they're producing. And so it's just a small portion of the virus. So it's not infectious, it's not a virus itself, but it's the protein that's produced. So some of the vaccinations are just the purified protein that are given to people, and actually those are ones most likely. The results preliminarily look pretty good. And ones that really made the headlines early on and that were the first to be developed, and that's the mRNA vaccines. And in that case, the RNA or the messenger RNA that instructs the cell to make the protein, that spike protein, is loaded in a lipid vesicle or a capsule. Think of it just as sort of a bubble. And these tiny micro bubbles contain the mRNA message that goes into your muscle and taken up by immune cells. Those immune cells produce that protein, that spike protein, and then the immune system reacts to it. So the third type is shown in the middle, where they actually, instead of having the RNA, one step before that is the DNA, and that's packaged in a virus shell that's a different kind of virus, not coronavirus. It's a virus called adenovirus. You all are likely familiar with adeno-associated virus, and as we'll talk in a minute, it's a completely different virus than adenovirus. Adenovirus is one of the common cold viruses, and they use the protein shell and some of the DNA of the virus and put in the DNA encoding this spike protein. So in that case, you do get injected with the virus shell that contains the DNA. It's taken up in the cells, but again, the same end game. The cell produces the spike protein that your immune system reacts to. And the immune system reacts to it primarily by making the antibodies, shown in blue on the far right, and that's what protects you from natural infection, because those antibodies are circulating through your bloodstream, just like antibodies against any of the vaccinations you might have had as a child. And if a virus enters your system through your nose or eyes or or your mouth, the antibodies bind to it and neutralize it, and you don't get disease. So again, just to reemphasize, none of these contain a live virus, so you cannot get an infection from getting the vaccination. If I could have the next slide, please. The question that has been raised by many and that raised some doubts about these vaccines, how was it done so quickly? Well, in point of fact, it really wasn't done quickly. These RNAs were done, the RNA vaccination technology has been under development for many decades. And the nice thing about them is it's sort of plug and play. That is, once you know the sequence for any protein that you want to make, you can synthesize the mRNA and package it. So as soon as the sequence for coronavirus COVID-19 was available in February of last year, companies jumped on it right away and began synthesizing the RNA for the spike protein, because we knew from prior research, other coronaviruses, that spike protein was going to be very important to bind to cells and cause infection. So that platform was already, they plugged in the sequence and had a product very early on. Now, it's difficult to see in the small writing on the rest of the slide, but there is also what's called an outbreak paradigm that's been well established in the vaccination community for many years, and that is that we can accelerate the process. So normally across the top, it's a very stepwise linear process where the vaccine is made and then tested, and then once it's tested, it's manufactured. But the outbreak paradigm shown in the bottom shows that we can overlay some of these processes. And that was also facilitated by some of the governments around the world putting up money right away to help defray costs or to promise to purchase the vaccine so that companies could de-risk it for themselves, know that they had a buyer, and start manufacturing it right away, even before it was proven to be safe and effective. Those vaccines would have gone to waste had it not been proven safe and effective, but this is the risk they take during an outbreak in order to get it out to the community much more quickly. So really, in point of fact, these vaccines are building on decades of science and decades of regulatory understanding about what to do in an outbreak. And it is remarkable that they were done quickly because the speed that they were done was very fast. And it's even more remarkable that they work so well because these were really the first mRNA vaccines that were pushed through this far. The technology was primed and ready to go, and there was plans to test other vaccines with this technology when coronavirus 19 came along. And so they just pivoted very quickly to use it for coronavirus 19. So there is a lot of science behind these vaccines and many, many years of research. Next slide, please. So what kind of side effects might you expect? The side effects have been in the medical literature now from the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine, which are very, very similar. Both of them are the type that I described with the mRNA vaccine on the bottom of that first slide. And here's an example figure from the Pfizer vaccine trial. And this shows you along the y-axis, that is the axis that's vertical on the far left, the percentage of participants in their some 45,000 people trial, what percentage of those participants experienced a given symptom. And they're color-coded for mild, moderate, and severe, or grade 4, which is life-threatening. And you can see there are no severe grade 4s, but there are mild, moderate, and a little bit severe in some of these categories. Across the x-axis, across the bottom, you can see the various kinds of reactions people got: fever, fatigue, headache, chills, vomiting, diarrhea, muscle pain, joint pain, and how many people used Tylenol or Motrin. And of note, some of these symptoms were fairly prominent in the placebo group. So in each symptom, you can see they list the vaccine, the fancy letters and numbers, versus the placebo. And some of these happened at high rates in the placebo group because we're all often experiencing these symptoms, and it just so happens during the time they got the placebo, they experienced these symptoms. Now, they didn't know which one they got, and they were reporting these symptoms not knowing whether they got the placebo or not. But nevertheless, certainly higher incidence in the vaccination, the most common being fatigue and headache, followed by chills and muscle pain and joint pain. And fever was not that common. Vomiting and diarrhea were not that common. And I understand anecdotally some of those are more common in younger age groups.
I'm sorry, we lost Dr. Cripe. I will just give him a moment to reconnect. I am so sorry that we lost Dr. Cripe. I think we will move on to Dr. Franson. So we're going to advance the slides, and I am pleased to introduce to you Dr. Timothy Franson. He is a principal at Faegre Drinker Consulting, and he works with rare disease advocacy organizations and industry to understand the impact of federal policies on their work. Dr. Franson.
Thank you very much, Mary, and thank you, community, for your interest. This is certainly something that has grown in importance for all of us during the past year. My role here, I am an infectious disease physician, but I work primarily in helping patient advocacy groups and companies work with FDA. And given these kind of situations, how can we help in understanding the steps that go into the approval of a therapeutic agent or a vaccine? So if I could have the next slide, please. I think it's helpful to talk about how people make decisions about important medical care aspects. FDA has certain responsibilities. The prescribing physician and pharmacists and nurses have provider responsibilities, and certainly patients do. The uniting thread across all of those is folks look at the benefit and risk of compounds in sometimes very different ways. FDA's responsibility is first to look at a proposed medicine or vaccine and understand what the benefit and risks are in a broader population. And that's what we'll be talking about here. Subsequently, based on an approval, either an emergency use authorization, which is not a full approval, and I'll get into that in a moment, that then may become a decision for a provider and a patient to speak about. So as we talk about this, FDA requires very detailed information for any of these decisions, and they have both internal and external expert reviewers to look at the information from companies about the safety and the effectiveness of vaccine candidates. And as decisions are made, they may be modified as new information becomes available. And I would have to say with COVID-19, there must be at least a dozen new articles every day that help us further refine our understanding of what may need to be done, the populations that need to come first in vaccination prioritization and why. And all of this is driven by good science and good medicine. All of these products that we're talking about have received emergency use authorization, but not full approval. And no product can be marketed or prescribed in the United States until what's called the standard of substantial evidence is met. And that means the quality of a product, its safety, and its relative effectiveness have been seen as satisfactory and appropriate with benefits outweighing risks. So if I could have the next slide. What really happens then with the process for a vaccine development? And I might say that there have been numerous therapy agents also developed under the same type of sequential approach. We're not talking about those today, but there are for people who have the misfortune of developing serious or moderate COVID, that there will be a number of emergency use antibodies and in some cases, one approved medicine, remdesivir, that are available for their treatment. So we're just talking about prevention now, not treatment. And the process for this is a company, a sponsor such as Pfizer and Moderna would be developing the compound, the vaccine, and they would put the test agent through clinical trials where people volunteer to be part of these exercises, which are very carefully designed so that it allows one to draw conclusions about how safe and how effective the candidate vaccines may be. When a sufficient amount of information has been accumulated, and I have to say, in this last year, the number of people enrolled in these kind of trials has been truly remarkable, in the tens of thousands for all of these. That then needs to be information compiled by the company and submitted to the FDA for independent review. In some cases, an advisory committee hearing has occurred, and that has been the case in the first two emergency use authorizations for new vaccines, Pfizer and Moderna. And in that case, the potential benefit outweighs the risk as a criteria. Once FDA offers then that so-called EUA, then the Centers for Disease Control and their ACIP, the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices, offers recommendations on who should get it, who first, how to allocate it, and the rationale for why. Why does somebody need to get in front of someone else, given that there are limited supplies right now? And it's been remarkable to look at, as these distributions have occurred and access, each state has developed their own modifications. In my experience here in Indiana, as I live in the Indianapolis area, the distribution has been very efficient and well planned, and they actually staged it by subsets of the age groups in what we'll call the tiers of exposure or the phases of exposure. In contrast, other states have not been quite so proportionate in how they approach things. So if I could have the next slide, what's the difference between an emergency use authorization and a full approval? And an emergency use authorization requires an emergency. The government has to declare something is an emergency, a bioterrorism threat, and in this case, a natural threat, which then allows FDA to trigger this EUA process. It is temporary. When the emergency is over, the EUA is over. So all these companies who now have emergency use authorization still have to do full approval study documentation. They may already have enough information, but additional steps are required for the safety, effectiveness, and the quality of the products in order to gain full approval, which is still likely to occur rapidly. And have no fear, there will be no gap between an emergency use authorization and a full approval. The EUA would be continued until full approval could be considered. If I could have the next slide. So the question is then, what's going on now? What do we have and what can we expect? So there are two approved messenger RNA-based virus vaccines. They are not live viruses, as Dr. Cripe has explained. You can't get the infection from them, and they've been very well tested, incredibly so. There are only minor differences. They're essentially equivalent in terms of their effectiveness and their safety. The Pfizer BioNTech vaccine is different in that it was tested to the age of 16 and above, so they received that authorization, although their number of patients at age 16 and 17 were relatively small, I think less than 100 individuals, if I recall correctly. Moderna has been tested down to age 18, although recently they constituted a trial looking at ages 12 through 17 and above. And there are discussions of, but I've not seen any information about actual start of studies of patients under age 12. There are 3 vaccines still to be assessed that are very near the authorization phase by 3 different companies. They are made by different mechanisms that Dr. Cripe has already discussed. And as we get more information on them, I know that that Cure SMA will be providing additional information. And they're essentially looking in their preliminary results very much like the 2 authorized vaccines, about 95% effective, including against most of these new strains that you're probably reading about in the newspaper, and very safe. So if I could have the next slide, please. So vaccine eligibility is determined in phases following the recommendations of the Centers for Disease Control, CDC. And the first phase, the 1As, were first responders, that is healthcare practitioners, those who drive the ambulances, staff the emergency rooms and the intensive care units and so forth. And then those age 75 and above, especially at nursing home base. Phase 1B is being activated, and now that is what is termed, I'll get the exact terminology, frontline essential workers. To some of us, that would be the people who deliver our pizzas when we're quarantined, but persons aged less than 75 to have vaccination who have predisposing illnesses, diabetes, heart disease, and other things that would make them more likely to get a respiratory disease such as COVID-19. And then the next phase of individuals will be age 60, it's called 1C, ages 65 to 74, and those patients age 16 to 64 who have serious underlying conditions. And then any essential workers who are not covered under 1B. So the questions are always, what don't we know? If I could have the next slide. We know about the near-term efficacy, and we know about safety up to 2 months post-exposure. It's been remarkable and exciting to see the few numbers of serious adverse events, as Dr. Cripe had talked about. There have been rare serious allergic reactions, which have occurred primarily in individuals who had prior allergic problems and serious reactions to other vaccinations or exposures. So we know that the protection looks good and the safety is good, at least to these several months after observation. As we continue to follow patients who've been in trials and observe those who've been vaccinated now under EUA, we'll learn more about the duration of protection, whether there are any remote adverse reactions, which are not anticipated, but always better to be safe and to monitor for that. And we need to look for enough patients and individuals to be vaccinated in the population until we would achieve about 70% of the US population getting what is termed herd immunity, or when the replication or spread of virus in the community is going to fall to such that natural processes should help control. So what do? My last slide. Like we all teach our kids and grandkids, socks before shoes. There are important things to do in addition to vaccination, and they're the basics. Let me add one thing that I don't believe I have listed here. Influenza vaccine is available, approved, and would be wise to get for children and adults. But hand washing, appropriate social distancing, use of masks, and then personally reviewing with your healthcare provider your vaccination pros and cons, especially for any of you who have had serious allergic reactions with prior experiences of this nature. And anticipate that there'll be new things on a weekly, if not daily basis. That's good. We're learning, we're adapting, we're understanding. And there's every reason to be optimistic that we are beginning to turn the corner with this epidemic. So maintaining our hopefulness and positive attention to these basic practices are key. And with that, Mary, I'll close, and I believe you want Tim Cripe and I to remain on with you.
So Tim, I'm actually going to have Dr. Cripe rejoin and pick up talking about side effects. And I think it would be great. Yes, welcome back, Dr. Cripe.
Yes,
I think it would be great if you started at the top about side effects, because I think our community really wants to understand what to expect. Thank you.
Yeah, my apologies for the interruption. So happy to pick up where we left off. On this slide, it shows the experience with the Pfizer vaccine. It's very, very similar to the Moderna vaccine, if not identical, and likely similar to other vaccines coming out, although we haven't seen those data yet. What's shown on this slide along the left side is the percentage of people who experienced one of those side effects that are shown across the bottom. And the percentage, as you can see, varies quite a bit depending on which side effect we're talking about. And they're categorized as mild, moderate, or severe, the green, blue, or orange. There were no grade 4 serious life-threatening type of side effects listed. So you can see the side effects included fever, fatigue, headache, chills, all the kinds of things you might expect with a virus infection. Vomiting, diarrhea, muscle pain, joint pain. And then it shows at the far right how many had to use a Motrin or Tylenol, something like that. Of note, the The majority are mild or moderate, and very few were severe. Also of note, there's a significant number that the placebo group experienced. Now, each person did not know whether they were receiving placebo or the actual vaccine. And the vaccine is listed with the funny, complicated letters and numbers there. But we all experienced various non-specific symptoms at different times, and you can see a significant proportion of people had fatigue, headache, and some with other symptoms in the placebo group. But certainly the incidence of these side effects was much higher in the actual vaccinated group, and tended, and interestingly enough, in some cases to be higher in the younger age, particularly nausea, vomiting, and diarrhea. You can see by the numbers above each bar were higher in the younger group than the older age group. Nevertheless, these side effects were all transient, meaning they only lasted about a day or so, and majority were mild or moderate. I can tell you that about 80% of people did get arm pain. I myself had this particular vaccine and got severe arm pain, hard to sleep on for one night. And then the second dose is a very similar set of side effects. In some cases, maybe a little bit worse on the second time around. That's what we're hearing from most people. For myself, I didn't have any symptoms except the second time around I was quite fatigued the next day, just for one day. So transient, mild, largely, and not life-threatening. There are occasional people who have an allergic reaction, a more severe side effect within a few hours of the dose or right away. Those tend to be people who already have many allergies and react to many kinds of substances. And those weren't really discovered until the vaccine was rolled out into the general population and they got more experience with it. So it is quite rare. So in general, the vaccine is safe, and as we've seen, quite effective. 95% of people were protected from any kind of infection, and 100% were protected from a severe coronavirus infection. So that's the great news. It's really fantastic, actually. And the other slide that I had prepared just to emphasize a point is shown on the next slide, and that is that viruses all have different shapes, sizes, and compositions, and the immune system is very specific in recognizing each one. They're very distinct, and so there's no cross-reactivity between these major virus categories. So if you become immune to COVID, as I've diagrammed here in the second virus, you're not going to be immune to the other viruses. And in fact, relevant to the SMA community, if you've received or are being considered for gene therapy, that's used using an AAV virus, adeno-associated virus, shown on the far right. Much smaller virus, different types of proteins, not in any way related to, actually not in any way related to adenovirus, even though they share one of the words in their name. And you can see adenovirus there, third from the right, very different size and shape, and certainly not related to COVID. So if you are being considered for the gene therapy or had the gene therapy, getting this COVID vaccination will not interfere with that. And getting an adenovirus infection or a vaccine made with an adenovirus, which is the Johnson & Johnson vaccine and the Oxford/AstraZeneca vaccines, they use an adenovirus completely unrelated to AAV. So no concerns there about cross-reactivity or affecting your immune status to AAV or affecting your ability to get that gene therapy. So that's the points I wanted to make. So I think we could probably go to the question and answer sessions, Mary.
Thank you, Dr. Cripe and Dr. Franson. Greatly appreciate all the information that you've shared with us today. So we're going to move into the Q&A, questions and answers section. Next slide. So once vaccinated, can you still silently carry and pass the virus on to those who are not vaccinated? Dr. Franson?
Sure. According to the Centers for Disease Control, that can happen, but it's highly unlikely. So the probability is low, but not zero.
Dr. Cripe, did you want to add?
Yeah, well, a relevant point to that is you can probably get some virus if exposed. If someone sneezed on you or something, you might carry it for a bit of time. You're not going to get infected, or at least a severe infection. You have 95% of chance of not getting infected at all, but 100% chance of not getting a severe infection according to the vaccine results, at least with the Pfizer and Moderna vaccinations. And so you may carry it for a short period of time, but it's not going to amplify in your body. And so therefore, spreading it is extremely unlikely. They may find it if they culture it, but giving it to someone else is extremely unlikely. But as Dr. Franson mentions, theoretically possible.
And I would just add that, and therefore we recommend that after you get vaccinated, continue to wear a mask, continue to socially isolate until we determine, you know, across the country that it is safe to loosen up those isolation guidelines. Thank you both. Next question, should I get vaccinated at a more equipped facility like a hospital that can handle dangerous side effects? Dr. Franson or Dr. Sorry.
Well, I think both of us can comment.
Yes.
From what I've seen, again, in my local setting, they actually have physician volunteers on site and available at most of the vaccine centers. The one caution may be for those who've had serious allergic reactions, they may wish to consult with their physician as to advice about having their shot at a more traditional facility.
And it should be mentioned that most places will want to observe you for a short period of time, usually 15 minutes after you get the vaccination, just to make sure you don't have an immediate reaction. And so nearly all of those side effects, actually all the side effects I think that I mentioned in the prior slide, happened 6 to 8 to 10 hours later when you're back home. And so, and all those were manageable at home, but if you did have a reaction later, you would be home anyway and would need to seek help with your regular avenues.
Great, thank you. Next question. If I am considering gene therapy or my child has received gene therapy and a COVID-19 vaccine becomes available for children, are there any concerns about interactions with the COVID-19 vaccines?
Yeah, I guess I preempted this one a bit, but I'll reiterate it again. So certainly with the mRNA vaccines, but even with the DNA vaccines that are using a adenovirus capsid shell it's a not infectious virus, but to deliver the vaccination. There is no interaction with the adeno-associated virus that's used for gene therapy, and therefore there's no cross immunity, there's no possibility of becoming immune to the gene therapy or affecting your treatment with gene therapy. So not an issue. Would like to put that one to rest.
Thank you. Next slide. Next question. Since many, if not all, vaccines require penetration into a muscle, is it effective for adults with little muscle, such as those with SMA?
Yeah, this is a really good question. And studies have shown with vaccines in general, and it hasn't been studied specifically with the COVID vaccine, but there's no reason to think it's different, that the way the immune system works and with vaccines in general, you can actually give them into the dermis, just below the skin, and they're equally effective as into the muscle. Now, if there's a big layer of fat and happen to be injected into the fat, it may not quite be as effective, but you do have what's known as dendritic cells throughout the skin and the muscle that take up the foreign protein and process it for the immune system. Most of the immune action actually happens in the lymph nodes. And actually, I know someone who actually had quite a bit of a swollen lymph node for about a week in their armpit after the vaccination. And so that's another side effect that can be reported and not to be feared. But most of the action is in the lymph nodes. So the cells that take up the vaccine in the arm migrate to the lymph node and do their thing there. And so even if there's a very little muscle, it's really not a problem. The vaccination should work just fine.
Thank you. Next question. Which shot is better, Moderna or Pfizer? Should we wait for more research since protein is involved?
I can jump right into that. And first, let me say thank you to the SMA community for sending questions in advance. And it was clear this is something that many parties had a question about. There's essentially no difference in those. With the limited supply available, many cities or counties have only one of the two vaccines. And once you get a shot with the first dose, with Moderna, for example, you need to get the second with Moderna. Also, my friend and colleague Tim here reminded me earlier that there really is not protein involved in these mRNA vaccines. They're essentially the RNA fragment inside a lipid bubble. So there's very little in the way of protein for one to be concerned about some kind of reaction to that constituent.
Yes, they're equal, and we would want anyone to get whichever vaccine they have available to them in their community. And we're hopeful that other companies will get their vaccines approved in the near future so that the use of any vaccine will be much more widespread than it is now.
Thank you. I don't see neuromuscular diseases listed among high-risk conditions to receive the vaccine earlier than the general public. Are there plans to move them, including SMA, to a higher priority level? So I'm going to take this question and have Dr. Franson, Dr. Cripe add on. So what we're seeing, so the CDC and the ACIP, which governs use of vaccines, do have recommendations for at-risk populations. What will not it won't happen that SMA or neuromuscular disease specifically will be called out or listed on those among the at-risk populations. However, the CDC, in listening to some of their webinars, have their intent was to have some flexibility in the guidelines, that local vaccine distributors are able to use judgment regarding at-risk populations. With that said, it's important to make your case, and it will be important that you advocate at the local level. I'm hearing that there are some public health communities or counties that do not have anything except like COPD, diabetes, heart disease, some of the most common conditions listed on the at-risk. I would encourage you to contact that county and advocate. Share the letter that is attached to this to our webinar today. Share this letter with them and ask them, how can you get access to an appointment? How can you get on a list to get vaccine earlier? And then let us know. I mean, if you are having great difficulty, you're not being heard, let us know. And we have letters. We this week sent a letter to the Biden administration, the CDC, asking them, requesting strongly that they take into consideration the neuromuscular populations across the country. Anything to add, Dr. Cripe or Dr. Franson?
Well put.
No, that's perfect.
Thank you. What is the latest information on COVID-19 vaccinations for children?
Well, neither of these approved vaccines had been tested in children before. They went down to 16 or 18, depending on which one you're talking about. So younger children have not been tested. That said, they weren't tested in pregnant women either, and now they're being given to pregnant women. Once they were shown to be generally safe, it was felt it was then safe to expand the different types of people that it's given to. Now, when it comes to younger children, there's a higher bar, of course, for demonstrating that. And these companies do plan on, and have started in some cases, I believe, to enroll patients in pediatric age ranges in separate trials from their original trials. And we are optimistic that they will get those results fairly quickly and then seek approval to administer vaccines to children sometime this summer, hopefully, if all goes well. So there's no real specific information yet. It's underway.
Agreed.
And it was just announced today. I'm sorry, did we skip ahead? Sorry. Dr. Fauci, I'm sorry if you said this and I missed it, but Dr. Fauci announced today that they expect to have vaccinations for children by summer. So we'll keep our fingers crossed. Next question. Would any of the vaccines reduce the effectiveness of Spinraza or of Risdi treatments for SMA? And these therapies, just for everyone's information, work by modifying splicing of the backup gene. Dr. Cripe?
Yeah, although it's a great question, and because they do alter the RNA, as you mentioned, the splicing of SMN2, and so one might think, well, if these are RNA vaccines, is that going to interfere? They're completely different mechanisms, routes of administration, effects in the body. There's no effect of these mRNA vaccines on splicing, and the splicing effects of these drugs are very specific to the gene they're targeting. So there's no reason to think that they will reduce the effectiveness whatsoever. So no concerns there.
Thank you. Next slide. I have other questions that I want to ask. One question that came to us through the chat is it possible at all for the mRNA to change DNA? Yeah,
I'll take that one as well. There's the canonical dogma in biology that's rarely violated is DNA to RNA to protein. There is some evidence in our ancestry, and there are some viruses called retroviruses that violate that dogma, that go backwards. They're RNA viruses and they get incorporated into the DNA. But these vaccines are not those derived from any of those processes. Those viruses that do that have specific enzymes called reverse transcriptases, and that allow them to go from RNA to DNA. And so although the dogma doesn't hold completely in biology, these vaccinations don't have anything to do with that. And so there's really no concern that they will alter your DNA.
Thank you. I have another question, which is, are any of the vaccine types more effective for people with SMA?
Well, I don't think that's been studied, so it would be very hard to come up with any answer on that. We hope that those studies will occur so that we have information to help the broader community.
I would add that there's no reason to think they would. There's, again, the pathology of SMA, the pathophysiology of SMA is really unrelated to how these vaccines are working.
Thank you. We have another question. Will the vaccine be as effective against all the mutations that have been cropping up?
Yeah, another great question. One of the things I wanted to get across when I talked about the spike protein is that these antibodies that you make an immune response to actually recognize not the whole protein, just a tiny part of that protein, what we call an epitope, an antigen, an antigenic epitope. Fancy words to just mean what the antibody is recognizing. So when you make this spike protein in your body, or when you get the spike protein as a vaccine, the immune response is against various aspects of this protein. And so the variants usually change one amino acid. So they're only changing one part of that protein, but you still have antibodies against all the other parts of that protein. So far when it's been looked at, all the vaccines are protective against the new variants. Now there's some data that vaccines tested in South Africa don't seem to be as effective as those tested when they're tested in the US, and there's some thought that maybe it's the variant in South Africa that's circulating that has actually now been detected in the US, that it may not be quite, the vaccines may not be quite as effective, and that could be because it's the variants changed one spot where one of the antibodies tests, but there's backup. There's other antibodies against other parts of that spike protein that are working. So it's possible that the coronavirus will figure out a way to mutate, to evade these vaccines, but it would have to change multiple different spots on that spike protein. So it's going to be very hard for the virus to do that. But it's also a reason we need to get control of this virus and not let it continue to grow and grow, because the more it grows, the more it changes. And that's natural. All RNA viruses like coronavirus change all the time, evolve. And so it may get lucky and find one that's not susceptible to the vaccine someday. So we need to get control of this worldwide as quickly as possible.
Yeah, it's interesting to look at, you know, it almost feels like the old carnival game of whack-a-mole, that once you get one beat down, the UK variant comes, South Africa and Brazil. Those are the three you've probably read about in the newspapers. I believe several of the companies are talking about looking at if problems such as Dr. Cripe suggested might, but low probability, occur, that they're looking at possible boosters. So folks are already thinking ahead to the what ifs.
Thank you both. Great questions. I have several questions regarding advocacy and getting the vaccine in a timely way. I have one which is more, and some of it's commentary, but I just wanted to bring it up. There's a lot of questions about access. How do we get access? Can Cure SMA as an organization help provide strategies? We will take that back. We totally understand how challenging this is, and at the local level, we've done most of our advocacy. Most of our advocacy has focused at the federal level and at the state level, and what is happening is that at the local level, there have been challenges. We also understand that California has altered the way that they are providing vaccine. They're actually doing it purely based on age groups and not looking at other qualifying issues. So there's a lot to work on. I just looking through my list of questions here. I think with that, we will call this to a close. I want to thank Dr. Tim Cripe and Dr. Tim Franson for their time, their expertise, and willingness to share with our community. This has been fabulous. Thank you. We will forgive you, Dr. Cripe, for the technology glitch. It happens. It happens all the time.
We live in.
But again, we thank you. We thank the community for joining us today. Everybody have a great weekend. We look forward to chatting with you again soon.
Take care.